I'm Valentine Moon, and are you ready to join me to become a master stylist with the OG stylist herself, Nikki? I am so happy Shining Nikki have invited me to bring this outfit straight from Mirrorland into the real world. And hopefully I can bring you some inspiration with this design and maybe a few clues as to something very special. If you've ever wanted to fill your wardrobe with fashion dreams come true, like hairstyles that defy gravity or dresses that seem to light up on their own, then you have probably already played Shining Nikki, or you've seen some of the outfits from it and it's something you think super cool. So, Shining Nikki are actually about to celebrate their 4th anniversary, and they've asked me to join them in Mirrorland to recreate the main outfit from their new event. The event is called Whales Fall, Flowers Bloom. And trust me, until you see this design, I cannot tell you how accurate that is! So, come along with me to recreate one of the most gorgeous dresses I have ever seen. And I won't keep you waiting any further because I know you're just as excited as I am. So without further ado, 3, 2, 1! How amazing is this? So the dress itself is called Vast Blossom, which definitely fits. And trust me, I cannot wait to turn myself into a giant flower petal. So if you're looking at this though and thinking probably the same thing I did when I first saw it, which is that, how are you going to take this and make it? Well, the answer is we're going to, and it's going to be tricky, but it's going to be so much fun along the way. So if you can see here, this is how I kind of broke down the design. So I kind of put some arrows, looked at the fabrics, and kind of tried to figure out how to bring her to reality. But one thing I do absolutely love about Shining Nikki and all of the Nikki games is that they do so much detail into every single one of the outfits. So you can zoom in and see like the individual sequins. Makes my little costume heart so happy. It also makes it rather easy when you zoom in and you go, I know exactly what fabric that is because they've used a reference for it. So for example, the petals on the side of the skirt, you can see how they're kind of very shiny and sparkly and coloured, but also thin and translucent. That is the tricky part. And you can actually see one of the fabrics behind me here. This is kind of one of the ones I'm looking at. So you can see how you can see me through it. But it's still got that gorgeous shine and a little bit of colour. So this is hopefully going to go inside the petals. I will talk you through all the fabrics individually so you can kind of get an idea of where we're going before we put everything together. And then I will show you, start to finish, how we will put the dress, the accessories all together to create this outfit. So let's take our wishes, pull for our dress Vast Blossom and the accessories, and since we are making her ourselves, we are guaranteed together. So without further ado, let's go to Mirrorland. So with that, I headed off to the fabric shops. I always like to look in person to see what different textures and colours go together best, and I found this perfect iridescent organza and this perfect pink satin, which when you put them together, the perfect colour. I also had a look for some laces and some sequins, and I found the most perfect fabrics. So projects like these take a lot of fabric. So we have material and more material. So the thing about dresses like this, especially when you have a Nikki dress, which has, if you look at the skirt here, like this incredibly delicate mix of blues and pinks and purples. It's very hard to do. So, first thing I did was start with how on earth I would make that kind of gradient. I tested a little bit of dye, tested a little bit of other stuff, but then I thought the best thing that would probably work would be custom printing. So these two are examples of some samples I got to see how it would work. So this was the design I ended up going with, a little bit of blues, a little bit of pinks, and sent it off to be custom printed on this, what they call Starlight Organza. And this is what we ended up with. How cool is that? Because when you get this behind it, you get Shining Nikki flower petals. I also have like a whole roll of glitter tulle. So this is very sparkly. I also have a lot of sequins, a lot of lace, and a lot of beads. So all of these things are going to combine, and hopefully we're going to turn ourselves into Nikki. Are you ready? Let's go. So first up was the dress itself, accurately named the Vast Blossom. I placed all my fabrics on a mannequin just to get a feel for everything and then started drafting the pattern of the main dress itself. She has this super cool little V in the bodice and this sequin panel, so I made sure to get all the little details in before I cut it all out and laid it onto my actual fabric.
And of course, with the shape of her dress, she has that big poofy skirt, so she needed a lot of petticoats to go underneath it. I used different layers of white organza and pink organza and blue and purple to kind of give that soft floaty effect she has underneath her skirts. All of them were cut into circles, like this one, and sewn with fishing wire in the hem, just to give that little bit of extra flounce, which of course you can never have too much floof when it's a Nikki dress. So with the hoop skirt, then comes the layers of the petticoats. I put them all in different layers to make it easier to get on, and especially when you're dealing with a lot of layers, it is so much easier in the long run to have them separate. And here you can see the twirl I get just from those 4 layers of petticoats. Then of course comes the actual flower petals themselves. So I ended up using 1 layer of glitter tulle, 1 layer of iridescent organza, and 1 layer of the custom printed organza to create that soft coloured effect while still having all that glitter and all that shine.
Hi, so we have petals. Just look at that! So this is 1 layer of like this custom printed organza, 1 layer of glitter tulle, and 1 layer of iridescent organza to make petals! Now I just need like 20 of them.
So back on the grind I went. Petal making was my job for the foreseeable future. I needed 20 altogether, 10 for the bottom skirt and 10 for the top. The top and bottom petals had a slightly different pattern as the bottom ones were bigger and wider at the bottom to give that big poof shape that she has when they stick up. And I just went about cutting them all out, pinning all the patterns to make sure everything was perfectly neat, and cutting every layer individually. These fabrics tend to fray quite a bit, so I had to make sure to be very careful not to rough them around too much, otherwise they would end up falling apart right before my eyes. But eventually we had everything cut and ready to sew. But sewing was not enough to get that big poof shape, they needed something more.
Hi, so for the petals we need to keep them puffing out, and just flat organza is just gonna go, it's just gonna flop. So we have 2 options for the wire. This is like a fishing wire that I use in the hem of a lot of my petticoats, and this is like a really quite thick clear kind of wire, and I just want to show you the difference. So we've got 2 petals here, one and the other, and you can tell which one has the thicker wire in it. So this one is in that, and this one is in this, and you can kind of see just like already how much that holds its shape so much better.
I took a little bit of a break in the middle of petal making to start working on the lines that go through the petals. So they have this gorgeous shimmer in the blues and the purple tones, and I found this perfect vinyl. So I drafted out myself a little pattern, cut it out on my cry cut, and got to work on the ironing. So all of these little lines I deliberately designed so they looked organic and flowy, and then just went to town on laying them onto the petals just to see what shapes I could create. Each petal has a slightly different arrangement, which I think makes it so fun because they're supposed to be flowers, they're supposed to be natural, and they're supposed to look pretty and kind of like they grew from nature. So hopefully I think I managed that with how I laid these out. I made sure to iron them down to stick everything down and make sure it was secure onto the organza, and it also meant that they were really thick. After getting all those stuck down, I moved on to the dress. So the actual underdress itself is a little bit different than what you might expect. I made this corseted underbodice to make sure that everything would lay nice and flat, and that both the petal layers were attached into 2 different layers so they would actually float up differently. So this bottom layer is going to end up having the bottom petals attached to it, and then another layer with all the little details you see on top will end up having the top petals on top. That way they will move independently, and when you spin, hopefully, they will end up spinning in a way that makes them look really natural and fits the dress. So after lacing it up for the first time just to see, this is what the underdress looks like. I love her so much, I felt so pretty, she's such a little pink fluffy dress. I was really sad about actually having to cover her up. But nevertheless, I started pinning on all the bottom petals to see how they would look. And I was so happy with how they started to turn out. All 10 of them eventually made their way on. I had to do a little bit of shifting around with the gathering, but then it was on to the rhinestones. Now, this might have been the longest process out of all of this, even more than cutting out and sewing all the petals together. because every petal has over 2,000 rhinestones in it. In this dress overall, there are over 50,000 rhinestones, which sounds insane, and it kind of is. But I'm so happy I did, because she sparkles in the most insane way. Until you see her in person, I cannot tell you how much this dress actually sparkles. So first I ironed on some of the glitter decals, so she has some little glittery lines, things, just to make the rhinestones pop a bit more. And then it was on to gluing. And of course, we cannot forget about the bodice details. So she has this super cool sequin panel across the top of her bodice, which I made out of this gorgeous pink iridescent sequin to match the rest of the dress. And here you can start to see why it was so worth adding all those rhinestones. Look at how shiny she is. She is like a little mirror ball, and it fits the artwork so perfectly. And here I finally was able to start putting on the top petals. This was what the top petal skirt looked like before I attached it to the oval bodice, which I had to overlock down to give this nice neat stitch, and then she was officially ready to be added on. And you can already see how much it looks like the artwork and how excited I am that she's starting to finally come together. So after making sure everything sat right, all of the measurements were correct, I could finally start sewing everything down for real. These petals were so big and so cumbersome, I had to leave them to the last minute to get them sewn down, but it was so worth it. And did you think we were done with the rhinestones? Because if you did, you were wrong. Because I decided that I really wanted to add that little bit more sparkle if 2,000 rhinestones wasn't enough on each petal. So I went back in with these gorgeous AB coloured crystals, which were a little bit of a different colour than the ones I used to do the lines. And they shine purple and pink and blue, which fits perfectly with the colours in her dress. And I took days just hand gluing on these rhinestones just to make sure the pattern looked perfect. I wish there was a quicker way to do this, but honestly, it was so worth it just to see the final result. I also found it very relaxing after a while to get into the swing of things and make sure everything was perfect. Did you find that as relaxing as I did? Well, now onto the actual main construction. She looks like a little bubble at the moment, but I promise those petals are going to come down and bloom into a flower. I then had to put it back on again, just to pin together all the petals to make sure where they were going to sit so I could hand sew everything down, because the petals in the middle were not going to go through my sewing machine. I barely got them through before, I definitely was not going to get them through now. The only thing I was going to be able to do was sew down the necklines of the two dresses to make sure they all held together and there was actually one dress to put on at the end of this. So here I am hand sewing down those petals. I wanted to make sure that the big petals and the small petals at the top did not separate so you could see the dress underneath. So in order to do that, I had to make sure that they were attached around the middle, but not all the way down to the bottom, because otherwise they would not be able to stand up. That was the next trick, which I was really struggled to find a way to do, but I'm so happy with what I worked out. So I used this clear fishing line and threaded it through the ends of each of the petals. I ended up using 2 points, one on either side of the ends, and threading them up to hold into the next top petal, and then from the top petal into the middle of the skirt. So with this clear fishing line, it is so thin you can't see it, but it holds this very thin petal up, so you get that blooming flower effect. Let me tell you, when I first saw it actually come together, and that the petals were actually holding themselves, I almost cried. I was so happy that it actually worked. Also because I actually did not have a backup plan for this, so if it had not worked, I'm not entirely sure what I would have done. Nevertheless, it did, so we're all okay, and you can see just how thin those fishing lines are.
Hi, so the main dress is finished. She's officially too big for this room, so we're going to take her outside and try her on for the first time. I am so excited.
I had to actually go to the garden to make sure I had enough space, but look at that twirl! I'm getting emotional just knowing that it actually worked. But there was no rest yet because I had to finish off the bodice details, including these petals that line the sequins, the lace detailing, the pearls and the rhinestones. Yes, more rhinestones. I think I actually might have bought out the entirety of England with these rhinestones. But the dress was finished! And I will show you at the end. Because before we put her all together, we need to do the accessories, including the wig. Now this is when I really started to feel like I've been transported straight into Mirrorland. Nikki herself can change her hair colour as much as she wants as a stylist, so we're going to try and do the same. But instead of my actual hair, this is going to be a perfect Nikki pink wig, featuring iridescent tinsel and a lot of sparkle because we need to try and get as close as possible to that gorgeous artwork. In the artwork, she has these gorgeous braided flower bun details, which took a little bit of figuring out to kind of make sure that they would fit on the wig head and also on my actual head and look right, because my head is not the exact shape of Nikki's in the game, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I added some extra little braids in the back to make sure I had the volume for the flower pieces, because she also has a couple of flowers in the back, which meant more hair if there was not already enough hair in this wig. Thankfully, it was a very thick one, so I was able to get that poof, and you can see me curling those braids in just to make sure I get that flower shape, which was tricky, but so worth it. I then curled up the ends because she has these gorgeous little ringlets, and I had to make sure we had those defined curls, and pin them all up to make sure the heat stuck. So that is the best trick I've ever been taught with wigs, is make sure you pin every curl so the heat sets nicely. I then started to have the most fun playing around with different laces and flower appliques to get that detailing she has in hers. I also added pearl strands and beads and rhinestones, and just look how she turned out! I then immediately went onto the headpiece because there was no time to waste. I drafted it out from the artwork itself to make sure it was as accurate as possible, and I used the same iridescent vinyl as I used in the skirt to make sure all the colours matched nicely. Now I had to peel out all the little inside details to get my outlines. That was quite time consuming, but it was so worth it to see the patterns start to emerge from in between. For the petals themselves on the headpiece, I used the exact same layers as I used in the petals for the skirt to make sure everything looked the same. I sewed it all down to make sure it was nice and neat, and even added in some wire just to make sure I could get that big shape on her head and it wouldn't fall flat. And here you go, you can see how it's pinned in, and you can see how it looks on. I was so happy with how this turned out. This was probably one of my favourite pieces out the whole costume, other than the shoes, which we're on to next. So I used these iridescent heels as a base, which already had the shine, so I was already one step into the Shining Nikki vibes with the iridescence. Now these are very high, which is good because I am not the height of Nikki, so I desperately needed to add a couple of extra inches. I then moved on to the tights as well because I needed to do them both together to make sure they looked right, and I used the exact same iridescent vinyl lines as the petals. You'll see a pattern here. I tried to make as many connections as possible to make sure everything looked cohesive. And of course, rhinestones, because rhinestones. I then did the exact same petals, just in like a slightly natural arrangement, and you guessed it, rhinestones. I think these shoes will actually blind someone if their light hits them right, which is a Shining Nikki staple with the shine and the sparkle. It's in the name. I adore how these shoes came out. I tried to add some more flowers into it and kind of make the petals look like they were growing out of the shoes, and I was so happy with how they turned out. Now, the last bit, the gloves and the underbodice. So I made this nude bodysuit to go underneath the dress to hold the gloves up to make sure they didn't fall down, and add all of the lace which she has around her neckline and going up onto the face. So I sewed that with a stretch stitch to make sure it all stretched, and you can see me laying the lace on. I had this lace fabric which was so perfect, and I cut out little pieces of lace and laid it on and piled it up to try and make the shape of the pattern she has. It already had this little bit of shape to it already, so you can see how I just curved it around my neckline, and it looks so good. I was so happy with how this was turning out. I then used the same iridescent vinyl, petals, and rhinestones. I think rhinestones is going to be the most used word in this video. I also added some pearl strands, as she has some pearls lining through her headpiece and onto the gloves, which added this perfect little trim just to separate the petals from the actual gloves itself and make it all look kind of gradiented. I hand sewed all that down, and you can see how it's kind of looking. I was so happy with how this was turning out. So with that laid down, here's one last look at the skirt before you see how everything's going to look together. I cannot wait for you to see this reveal. I am so excited. you can see the last little bits of details I added, including the neck pieces and the brooch details. And let's do a 3, 2, 1. I cannot thank you all enough for following along on this adventure, and I hope you love how this project turned out as much as I do. I cannot thank Shining Nikki enough for giving me the opportunity to recreate such a cool design, so download Shining Nikki now, not just to see this cool dress and play the anniversary event, but see all the other incredible costumes and designs that feature in the game, and figure out your style and become a master stylist. Thank you so much for following along. Bye!